What up, YouTube? This is Steven, and welcome back to another video. In this video, I want to talk about and address light skin privilege. Now, um, oftentimes when we talk about privilege, you know, within the community, like we don't have any problems when it comes to addressing and talking about like white privilege, right? Are other types of privileges, like say rich people's privilege, or thin privilege, or maybe even like male privilege, right? Or beauty privilege, that's one too. Yeah, we don't have any problems talking about other types of privileges, but oftentimes when it comes to light skin privilege, all of a sudden, folks want to act brand new and act like, oh, things are just equal across the board, and we're all black and there's no difference between us. While again, we may all check the black slash African American box, right? When it comes to, how we identify ourselves, what we consider ourselves, etc. We claim a black identity, right? But there are we will experience differences within the community and outside the community based on skin tone and uh, racial features. That's not really anything that I think is like so surprising. It shouldn't be anything that's very surprising. I mean, for example, you know, take Mariah Carey. Mariah Carey's experience will be vastly different from, say, Viola Davis's experience in and outside of the community. Does anyone argue that? Is anyone arguing that, right? I it's really obvious, right? You think that, I mean, I don't know how Mariah Carey really identifies herself, but let's say that she does identify herself as strictly black, full stop, right? And Viola Davis, she identifies as black, full stop. Again, do you think that their experiences are going to be congruent 100%? You think they're going to go through this same experience when it comes to like the job market, when it comes to the legal system, when it comes to dating, when it comes to um, interacting with people? No, I think that their experiences are going to be different. Um, and does anyone think that their experience wouldn't be different? If so, let me know in the comments section and explain why. So for me, I feel like, it's a little shady and dishonest when light skinned people particularly deny light skin privilege or try to play it down, or, say like, oh, we're all black at the end of the day. We're all, white folks all consider us ends at the end of the day. And other types of um, dismissive rhetoric, right? And while those things may be true, at least on some level, it like we are all black, but we're kind of not all the same black, right? That's the thing. Um, so I guess I can just go into some things that I think some light skinned people might need to know about, right? And I guess not necessarily just light skinned people, but just I guess the community in general, but especially light skinned folks, because I think like these are the folks that really need to be educated. And for me, I feel like if this was, say, a white person, I wouldn't even be taking the time to educate this white person. I'm like, if you don't believe in white privilege, I'm not going to be the one to educate you. I'm going to leave that to the so-called good white people. That's what they need to be doing, right? But when it comes to, us inside the community, I think it's different. It's different. Um, as well, I think that, you know, lighter skinned people should be the ones to, check they people, their light skinned folk, if they're getting out of line, if they're doing something that's ignorant, that's perpetuating colorism, and that is divisive. Like, a light skinned person needs to step up and check that person. You need to do your light skin community service, your each one teach one. I got that from Tatiana Mercedes, by the way. But yeah, you know. So this is like, me doing my light skin community service, my each one teach one. Because there was a person in my comment section, I won't reveal the person's name, but the person said that, um, he doesn't feel that, there's really, he feels like there is light skin privilege, I believe. Let me read the comment, all right, to make sure I'm getting this right. You know, we were having a conversation, and at one point he said, can you give a scenario? We were talking about light skin privilege. And I was kind of listening on some things, and he was kind of dismissive of some things. And he was like, well, can you give a scenario? I know light skin privilege exists, but I do not think white people subconsciously put us in different groups when they decide whether or not they want to kill or rape us. Okay. Let's see. And he also goes on later in the post to say, please do not separate light-skinned people from dark-skinned people if you're actually for black people. Yes, there is light-skinned privilege, but we need to eradicate this Willie Lynch complex from our psyche. But the thing is, I am for black people. So that's why we have to address this. It's not that I'm trying to cause a division or to separate, right? I'm just trying to educate. But the thing is that pushback that happens, right? When like some privileged people don't want to acknowledge their privilege. Although he did acknowledge privilege, so like he acknowledged it, but it wasn't really acknowledge it, but at the same time somewhat dismissive of it, like somewhat here and there, right? And I hope that, okay, I didn't name the person, so I hope the person doesn't take offense. I'm not trying to call the person out, but he did bring up something that needs to be addressed, right? And also, I've kind of noticed this on a couple of YouTube users who are light skinned and who are males who are somewhat dismissive of light skin privilege. Yeah. Again, not naming names, right? All right, so I think I'm going on for a minute now. So let me go into some actual things that some light-skinned people might not really consider as privilege, but a darker-skinned person might consider it. Like once I break it down, then you're like, oh, okay, all right. So here's the privilege, which may not seem like a privilege at first, but let me explain. All right. White people are more likely to, like, let's say a white person is in a majority black situation and they may need some help. They're more likely to come to a lighter skinned person. And some of you may be thinking, well, is that really a privilege, having to deal with white people? But think about it. That white person feels that that black person is, safe, less of a threat. So that sort of factors in when it comes to, say, employment, dealings with the legal system, and as well just dealings in general society. So being seen as a, non-threatening in a society that views black people as threatening is a privilege, because they will be less likely to target you, right? They will be less likely to try and, hinder you in a way. And of course, we all, I think black people as a whole are oppressed and are discriminated against, but I think lighter skinned people get it easier. And I don't, I don't like to go back to the slave days, but of course, we got to go back to the slave days, right? Back in the slave days, the lighter skinned folks had an easier job than the darker skinned people. Lighter skinned people were, lighter skinned slaves were probably more likely to be educated than a darker skinned slave was, more likely to be skilled, have a, skill set versus a darker skinned slave. Um, more likely to be given, some type of freedom than a dark skinned slave. Um, it's rumored that um, George Washington, the president of the United States, had a son who was part black. And, you know, they say, they say that George Washington never had a kid, never had any kids, but it's rumored that he actually did have a kid with a female slave. And that kid was actually taken care of really well, considering. And he was given his freedom like at 21 years old. And also he was educated. Like that white family did look out for him, possibly because they knew that that was his child, as well. So I guess that's another example. But to bring it more so back into present, let's bring it back into the present, right? All right. So another privilege, being seen as non-black, or being seen as something that is not, well, I guess it's the same thing. Being seen as non-black in society, right? Again, Mariah Carey would be a great example of that. She may check the black box, but when people see her, they're not seeing like a black woman, at least not the black woman that comes to their mind when they hear the word or the phrase black woman. So this works in favor not only with white people, but also people of other ethnic groups too, because, quiet as it's kept, people of other ethnic groups do have, anti-black sentiments. So that is a privilege that I think that some light-skinned people overlook and may not feel that it's a privilege. And, oftentimes when you're so used to something, it doesn't seem like it's a privilege. But let's say we take that away from you. You probably gonna notice that, oh, like I'm kind of being treated a little differently, Um, so I guess that kind of factors into maybe kind of like um, being considered like quote unquote like a safe black person, and which is really good and advantageous when it comes to like again the job market and dating and the legal system, um, as well. Probably even like the educational system too. Like probably like lighter skinned children are more like less likely to receive like the punishments that darker skinned children seem to receive, and more likely to be less likely to be labeled a problem child, even if the child is going through some issues. They're more likely to have some sympathy and to, acknowledge their humanity, right? Let's see. Another privilege that I think goes over light-skinned people's heads at times is being able to date who you want and not be considered self-hating. I mentioned that in the previous video, but yeah, notice light-skinned people are hardly ever accused of having self-hate issues, hardly ever. Only time I would think that comes up is if like light-skinned people, and by the way, light-skinned and biracial, light skin kind of covers in this particular video. Light skin, I'm using it as a blanket term for just lighter skinned people, no matter your whether you're first generational or multi-generational. For this particular video, I know I make distinctions, but for this particular video, to make it easier on me so I don't have to say so many words, I'll just use light skin, right? All right. So Yeah, light skinned people are never accused of having self-hate issues unless they don't claim their blackness. Other than that, they're never accused of having self-hate issues. Let's say if like a light-skinned woman says, "Oh, I only date like the darkest of the darkest men," no one ever accuses that light-skinned woman of having a self-hate issue. They're just like, "Oh, okay, that's what's up," you know. Um, or if like a light-skinned dude says like, "Oh, I don't really date light-skinned women." No one accuses, and it goes both ways too, with light skinned women and light skinned men. No one accuses them of having self hate issues, right? Like, oh, I don't date light skinned dudes, or like a light skinned dude is like, oh, I don't really date light skinned chicks. No one ever accuses light skinned people of having those issues. Um, Self hate issues, on the other hand, a dark skinned person, a dark skinned man saying, I don't date dark skinned women. I don't date dark skinned women. Come on. People gonna look at that dude like, what? Really? As dark as you are, you don't date dark skinned women? Really? You self hating, you know, same with a dark skinned woman. She says, like, oh, I only date light skinned dudes. I don't really deal with dark skinned dudes like that. And people will look at her like, whoa, you're like, she crazy. Like, you really got some issues. You got some self-hate issues, right? Um, and also, one thing that I notice with darker skinned women, sometimes they kind of feel the need to apologize when they do have a history of dating lighter skinned men. Um, a little bit, a little bit. Notice, like a lot of times, when it comes up, many darker skinned females will say that, oh, no, those are, light skinned men typically approach me a lot more than dark skinned men. So because of that, they may have a dating history that, has like a lot of light skinned men, because in their experience, light skinned men seem to be the ones that try to holler more than the dark skinned dudes, right? But I think they may feel a certain type of obligation to set the record straight and make it so that people don't think that they're are have like they're color struck or have self-hate issues, or they'll just be like, those are the men that typically approach me, so that dark-skinned men don't look at the dark-skinned women and be like, oh, you color struck, you got self-hate issues, because like in and outside the community, folks love to go in on black women, especially dark-skinned black women, right? you know on the other hand, the dark skinned dudes a lot of times seem to approach light skinned women, right? And I guess the same could be said about light skinned women who have a history of dating dark skinned men. They could say, like, those are the guys who approach me. You know, that's true. They can have that same thing too. But the thing is, light skinned women don't ever feel the need to say, oh, dark skinned men are the guys who approach me. They never feel the need to say that, though. Why? Because no one ever accuses light skinned women of being self hating or being color struck. But people accuse dark skinned women and just dark skinned people of that. So they may feel the need to explain themselves a bit more. So, to sum it up, light skinned people do have a privilege when it comes to dating, even outside of the community too. People don't trip when light skinned folks date outside the community. Um, they just like, oh, okay. Even if it's like a white person, they won't trip, or like a Latino, a Middle Eastern, an Asian person, etc. Like, people don't really trip about that when it's a light skinned person doing that. You know. So yeah, that's a privilege, right? You know, another privilege that I think goes over light-skinned people's heads is racial profiling and police brutality. I think that lighter-skinned people in general are less likely to be the victim of overt violent racism. Usually, when you look at the victims of overt violent racism, they're usually darker. They're not usually like light-skinned folks. Not to say that there's not light-skinned people who have been a victim of overt violent racism, because there is, there are, but it seems like it's more so directed at darker skinned, black people. And I think that's because black people, when you see a black person who is dark skinned, they're black. From a distance, black from a distance, right? You see that person from a distance, it's a black person when it's a dark skinned black person. But when it's a light skinned black person, you don't know for sure what race that person is until you kind of get up closer to them, right? Also look at the latest victims of police brutality, darker skinned men, your Eric Garner, I believe your Tamir Rice. Well, he's a kid, but they do like to make kids into men when it comes to black men, right? Like, you 12 years old, oh, and that's a man, shoot him down. Let's see, Eric Garner, also Sandra Bland, Breon King, and also, let's go into this right quick. Corinne Gaines, she's light skinned, right? And some people say, she was a victim of police brutality, right? But notice, though, they went on for a minute before they even took it there, the cops, right? I'm not saying what the cops did was right and justified, right? But I'm saying she was giving like a lot of leeway in that situation, I think, more so than if she was a darker skinned female. I think they would have been more likely to have been violent with her. But she was a lighter skinned female, so I think that worked to her advantage in that situation to an extent, as far as being given the opportunity to just surrender, like, surrender. And even then, it's like, I'm not sure who opened fire first in the situation. I'm not completely sure about that situation, but yeah, look at that. How do you think things would have went down if it was a darker skinned female? You think it would have been a little different? You think it would have been exactly the same? Let me know in the comments section. And also, when it comes to the legal system, and being handed out sentences, for crimes, it's said, people have done studies that show that lighter skinned people seem to get less jail time for similar crimes, versus dark skinned people. Like, say you have a light skinned person and a dark skinned person, and they do a crime that's exactly the same or extremely similar. They say that, like, the lighter skinned person is less likely to get, a harsher jail sentence. The harsher jail sentence seems to go more so for the darker skinned person. And I've even heard some people say that the differences, when you really go into it, is actually kind of like reminiscent of the differences between white people and black people when it comes to the legal system. That's what I've heard. And let's see, another privilege that I can speak on is being able to be the face of your race, or be the positive face of your race, to be the pretty, the good face of your race, to that allows people to have humanity for the race. For example, I don't know if you guys remember or not, but Ebony or Essence, I think it was Ebony though, they did a cover for their magazine, right? And it was about police brutality. And the people they used for this cover were Harry Belafonte, Jesse Williams, and Zendaya Coleman. Notice that those three are like light-skinned black people, right? And two of them are first-generational mixed, right? Directly mixed. Notice, though, who when you look at the victims of police brutality, who seems to be the actual victims more so? But the darker skinned people, right? But they're using these lighter skinned people to bring awareness to this issue. And I think that was possibly a strategic move, and maybe because Ebony may be color struck as well, maybe, but possibly a more strategic move because people, people outside the community, you know, white, Latino, Asian, what have you, are probably more likely to acknowledge the humanity of lighter skinned black people versus darker skinned black people for some reason. So, you know, being able to be used as the face for black people and to kind of give like, you know, a, to be the positive face of black people, you know, the face that garners sympathy, the face that is the human interest story, the face that is treated and seen as human, people acknowledge your humanity, you know. Mhm. And as I mentioned before, when it comes to dating outside the community, I mean, some people are going to argue, well, is this a privilege? Is it like a privilege that we should be advocating for? Not really. I don't promote swirling among black people. You know, preferably, black on black love, right? Preferably for me, how I view it. But also, I do feel like, I don't know all people, I don't know all black people. All black people don't know me, right? So I can't sit up here and say I know what's best for you when I don't really know you, right? I don't know your personal story, your struggles, um, challenges, etc., right? I don't know that. So that's why I just try to just say like preferably, I don't promote it, but at the same time, I don't. I try not to really like, look down on it unless that black person, is like down in their people while they're interracially dating. Then I'm like, okay, that's a problem. So like, if you're gonna date interracially, okay, that's cool, but just don't be knocking black folks while you're doing it. Just be like, okay, I'm happy over here with Rebecca, with William, with Marisol, with Ramon. you know, who you be, whoever you be with, right? That's cool. All right, but when it comes to interracially dating, I think lighter skinned people may fare better outside the community when it comes to interracially dating versus darker skinned people. Not to say that darker skinned people don't, fare better, have, quality folks, quality mates, and stuff like that, right? But I'm just saying, um, you know, look at, say, Prince Harry. His girlfriend is mixed race. You know, look at I think Robert Patterson from Twilight. His girlfriend is also mixed. Light skin too. Um, as well, I've mentioned before, for the dudes, like Emma Bunton, Baby Spice from the Spice Girls, her boyfriend, light skin, mixed race. um, let's see. Another example would be, um, I think, Cash Warren and Jessica Alba. Cash Warren is light skinned, mixed race. So you see what I'm saying, right? All those people I mentioned, they received a come up from dating interracially. Even the dudes, which is a little unusual, but there are, you know, some like, because usually the dude is supposed to give the girl the come up, but in some situations, so like the dudes, the lighter skinned dudes especially, got to come up from interracially dating. You know, we used to seeing women get to come up, but not so much men, right? Um, so that's something to think about. You know, I know there's other examples, and a lot goes into that, et cetera, et cetera, right? I'm just saying. So I think I mentioned like quite a few things about light skin privilege, that some privileges that some darker skinned people may not have, or at least may not have as readily available to them as, say, lighter skinned people. Um, you know, um, Even when it comes to media promotion, even though when it comes to light skinned and dark skinned men, even though dark skinned men are promoted more so in the media, light skinned dudes actually do have, you know, a space in the media. And I think it actually works to light skinned men's advantage not to be the face of black men, because a lot of times the face of black men is negative, you know. So that I think that kind of works in our favor, not to be the face of black men. So when people see us, they don't associate us with like negative stereotypes of black men, black people. Again, um, we all may check black, we all may identify as black/African American, but we do have different experiences, and we have to be truthful about that. We have to be honest about that and candid about that, you know? And I do sometimes hesitate to talk about this, not so much because of like, oh, I don't want to acknowledge it, but more so because people may look at it as if I'm bragging, you know? And that's not what I'm trying to do. But there are some light skinned people who do kind of try to use this as a way to brag. Like for instance, that video that Chrissy posted with that featured that light skinned chick. By the way, people are like, she ain't even light skinned. People seem more upset about her not claiming a light skin identity than actually what she said in the video. But yeah, noticing that video, she was all listening off like, oh yeah, it's it ain't our fault that men rap about us in songs and prefer us and leave us for you, and we get the parts over you when it comes to acting, et cetera, et cetera. Right? She was talking about light skin privilege, but she was doing it in a bragging type of way, in a boastful type of way. And when I do this, I don't want to come off as if I'm bragging or boasting, because that's not where I'm coming from with this. I'm coming from this more so as a place to educate more so lighter skinned people, and also to acknowledge, colorism, and to at least at the very least, at least acknowledge it, and also finding ways to educate light-skinned people, and as well to have light-skinned people perhaps use their privileged position to help darker-skinned black people. Because a lot of times I think light-skinned people slash mixed race people are kind of used somewhat as a buffer between black and white people. Like, oh, when this light-skinned person gets this promotion, perhaps they are paving the way for more ethnic and darker skinned people to also have a position like this later on in the future. Like say Barack Obama, like he kind of did he broke down a big barrier. He's mixed race, he's mixed, but he did break down that barrier, so it makes it a little easier for like a darker skinned person to come through now, right? So yeah. This was a bit much, this is I didn't mean to go on for this long, I didn't mean to, but I had a lot to say. So I hope you stayed with me, and I hope you were able to get something from this video. I hope you don't think I'm bragging or being boastful, because I'm not. Again, I'm just trying to do this to educate, because really it could be really easy for me just to pretend and be blind and pretend. Just like, what's that? What's light skin privilege? I'm not privileged. You know what I had to go through? I had to take public transportation. I had to go to public schools. I had to, you know, work minimum wage. That's not privilege, right? You know, you always hear those type of arguments, right? But again, we're talking about in the big scheme of things, you know. And really, ultimately, as far as I'm concerned, my take on this. This isn't something that's debatable. Light skin privilege does exist, just like white privilege does exist. That's not debatable with me either. Neither of these are debatable. They exist. We may not want to acknowledge them, acknowledge your existence or anything. They exist. That's not up for debate, okay? And that goes to whoever, the light skinned people who think it doesn't exist, or even some dark skinned folks. All right. But more so, I'm directing this more so towards light skinned folk, because I think dark skinned people get the message overall. But yeah. So thanks a lot for watching. Adios and goodbye for now.